Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the history of pilgrimage. In Part 1, Wrath of the God Emperor, we will talk about the role that pilgrimage played in Greco-Roman religions and how this influenced early Christians. The ancient scholar Archimedes, upon witnessing magnetism, is said to have declared, "The gods dwell in all things." Ancient Sumerians, Egyptians, and Greeks likewise saw the handiwork of the gods in nature and processes today explained by experimental science. Of the 7 wonders of the world, 6 dealt with the worship of such gods. Pilgrimage by devotees of this or that god to their shrines and temples on earth likely dates back 5,000 years. People traveled long distances, sometimes as individuals and sometimes in groups, on routes that took them past striking geographic features such as mountains, which were seen as the handiwork of the gods. Upon the pilgrims' arrival, they took part in a range of rituals. These included pan-Hellenic festivals, musical and athletic events that drew people from across the many city-states of Greece. Kings even stopped wars so that musicians and athletes could safely travel. Others came to sacred places to make votive offerings to thank the gods for a cure from a disease. For example, a man who had a broken leg healed would offer a wax leg to the gods in thanksgiving. Most famously, the rich and famous came to the oracle at Delphi to seek answers to life's pressing questions like who to marry or whether or not they should declare war. Many pre-Christian cultures saw the temples as the literal homes of the gods, and by the Roman era, a tourism industry developed in Athens to show pilgrims where to find this or that temple. Secular and religious scholars debate whether Christian tradition stemmed directly from this pagan practice, but it's worth remembering that early Christians lived, worked, and worshipped alongside pagans for centuries. Of course, religious life transformed in the centuries following Christ's ministry. During the first 3 centuries after Christ, the Church focused on the New Testament teaching that God is present everywhere in the world, not just in special places. A shift from Jewish traditions may have occurred in part because of the destruction that Jerusalem suffered under Roman rule. The occupying Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD and razed the city to the ground following a revolt in 135 AD. The Romans even renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina and built a temple to the pagan goddess Venus upon the Temple Mount. Other cities such as Caesarea, Antioch, and even Rome gradually became more important to the early Christians. By the 2nd century AD, Christians began traveling to Palestine to learn about important biblical sites and even visit small Christian communities that dated back to Christ's ministry. But after the terrible upheavals known as the Crisis of the 3rd century, people turned to the new faith as never before. After the 50-year crisis, the number of Christians grew from several 100,000 to millions, likely in part because the early Christians were among the only people who both cared for victims of the plague and saw to it they received a decent burial. This profoundly rattled pagan Romans of the Old School. During the year 303 AD, the Emperor Diocletian had an unpleasant encounter with the new faith. Diocletian and his co-emperor Galerius carried out sacrifices in Antioch to thank the gods for a successful campaign against Persia. A Christian named Romanus pushed his way through the crowd and accosted the emperor. Romanus declared Christ to be the one true God, and condemned the emperors for worshipping false idols. Emperor Diocletian acted like the wrathful god he fancied himself to be. He ordered his soldiers to cut out the man's tongue and then beat and strangle him to death while the emperor looked on. Soon after, Galerius convinced Diocletian to move against the religion. Diocletian happily complied by pulling down a large church within his capital at Nicomedia. His soldiers looted the building before burning the library. Next, he ordered all Christian books to be surrendered for burning. Christian senators and army officers faced immediate discharge. Priests faced arrest if they did not make libations of wine and grain to an image of the god Emperor Diocletian. Early Christians did what their grandfathers did during the Decian persecution 50 years before. They surrendered less important books to be burned and publicly renounced their faith while still worshipping in private. Some church scholars even declared false renunciations made during a time of persecution to not be a sin. After all, someone needed to survive for the church to live. Only a handful of defiant Christians chose martyrdom over life, and from their heroic example, a cult of martyrs emerged, which would play a central role in pilgrimage during the centuries to follow. For example, a 14-year-old Christian girl named Santa Eulalia in Iberia was taken by her mother into the countryside to avoid the Diocletian persecution. Unwilling to back away from her faith, Santa Eulalia instead returned to town and, of course, went before a stern Roman magistrate, who said that she could save her life if she simply burned a little frankincense to the emperor. Instead, Santa Eulalia threw down the idol, trampled upon the cake laid for the sacrifice, and spat at her judge. During the torture that followed, Santa Eulalia's hair caught fire and the smoke and flames surrounded her head and face. Her hagiography says that a white dove came out of her mouth and flew upwards towards heaven when the holy martyr expired. Upon seeing this, the Roman executioners grew so terrified that they fled and left her charred body on the floor. Today, relics linked to Santa Eulalia are kept with great veneration at Oviedo, where she is honored as patroness. Her site would become one of many visited by Christian pilgrims over the millennia. That wraps things up for this episode of the Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.